Night on the Crimean steppe had a metallic taste, like rusted rails and cold breath when the rumor hardened into shape. Men had joked about it for months. Fantasy artillery, a caricature of Nazi engineering, a weapon so big it could only exist in propaganda reels and tall tales traded over watery soup. Then floodlights clicked on along a custom spur west of Bakhchisarai, and steel that had once been ore stood revealed in its final arrogance, an 80-centimeter railway gun, its ribbed barrel turning the horizon into a measuring stick, its twin bogies straddling parallel tracks like the ankles of a titan. "Unmöglich," a captured Red Army engineer whispered before he caught himself and swallowed pride along with the word. Impossible. The German officer at his side only nodded towards the crews assembling cranes and generators and answered with a sentence that turned myth into schedule. "First registration tomorrow at dawn." Schwerer Gustav did not look like war, as soldiers usually know it. Mud and men and sudden decisions. It looked like a construction site dragged to the edge of a city under siege and told to breathe. The weapon's anatomy defied infantry scale. A 1,350-ton frame, twin-tracked to distribute weight across rails laid by a regiment whose shovels had learned to speak in ballast and ties. A barrel long enough to require its own grammar of support. Trucks of sections arriving in a procession that made even veterans watch with a child's attention. 25 cars carried everything a god would need to pretend humility. Cranes with booms that could hoist a house. Power carts humming with polite menace. Flat cars stacked with 7-ton concrete-piercing shells whose blunt noses made the ground crew swear softly when palms met cold steel. A smaller army orbited the big gun, each man a sentence in a paragraph that would end with the word fire. On a paper map, the siege of Sevastopol presented itself as angles and distances, arcs of range intersecting with old fortress lines the Tsar had once blessed. In the galleries and casemates under the sap-streaked hills, the war felt different. It felt like damp air and chalk dust, and the small electricity that lives in the lungs of men who have been underground too long. The port's defenses belonged to a different century, but had been fed by a new one. Reinforced concrete poured in thick layers, armored turrets half buried like iron mushrooms, galleries bored into rock so that the city could take a punch and still fire back. The Maxim Gorky batteries, coastal guns with the temperament of mountains, anchored arcs that made German planners frown at their pencils. The Luftwaffe had already pounded the place. The 600-mm Karl-Gerät mortars had already spoken in syllables the earth knew how to translate into fear. Still, certain doors would not open, certain throats would not close. Enter a gun designed to argue with geology. Gustav's barrel could push a 7,100-kilogram concrete-piercing round out past 39 kilometers and, depending on elevation and charge, into the realm of 47. A sling for stones that made the earth itself blink. The German firing table promised penetration up to 7 meters of reinforced concrete, under the right angle of strike. The weapons champion spoke of an underground munitions depot rumored to sleep beneath the sea line, 30 meters below the surface, and swore the right shot would wake it with a flash nobody would forget. Skeptics scoffed, because skepticism is a soldier's first defense against optimism, wearing shiny boots. Even some German officers called the project a vanity, Nazi gigantism ironing a swastika into physics. Yet the crews who rode the 25-car caravan east did not travel on ideology. They traveled on technical orders that turned fantasy into torque settings and cable lengths and firing cycle intervals of 30 to 45 minutes. Setup was theater and factory at once. Track layers cut a branch from the main line and laid a tailored spur so Gustav's twin bogies could straddle parallel rails. Grading crews argued with the slope until it admitted a weapon that hated the slightest uncertainty. The barrel traveled separate like a dignitary. Cranes lifted it in a mooing of steel and settled it into a cradle with a tolerance measured in size. Power carts found their rhythm. The loading hoists rehearsed their ballet. Ammunition teams traced chalk lines and painted numbers because a 7-ton shell must be the right shell, at the right minute, in the right sling. The first registration round at dawn drew a fusillade of whispered profanity from men still learning to believe what they had seen in daylight. The blast punched the morning into shards. Seismographs quivered. Pigeons became thought without bodies and vanished as a collective noun. 10 seconds later, somewhere nearer the sea, a sound like a door to a deep room slamming shut came back across the hills. German firing logs that week read like a monk's ledger. Columns for time, charge, elevation, deflection. Weather notes in a handwriting that cared about humidity. Each entry, if you stood at the breach, felt less like a number and more like a decision with hundreds of fingers. To load Gustav was to choreograph men and cranes and gravity itself. A shell left its cradle, swung along a traveling hoist into the barrel's shadow, met the loading tray with the slow respect the heavy reserve for the heavier. Bagged charges, carefully numbered and measured to keep the barrel's temper, followed under watchful eyes that had already memorized the color and tear of good propellant. The breach closed with a dignity that could be mistaken for reluctance. A last check. Lanyards clear, the world warned, the schedule satisfied. Fire. The blast did not so much sound as reassign air. The gun's recoil system chewed the force into chemistries of heat and motion, and the shell left like a verdict. What it meant on the ground can only partly be told from the German side. In the city and in the fortress lines, the first shots translated themselves into cracks crawling across concrete that had believed itself a kind of geology. Shockwaves tunneled into galleries. Blast doors that had been sized for lesser grammars bent like men who learn new languages late in life. In one battery, a switchboard jumped off its mounts and shattered a man's opinion of safety before it shattered the man's eardrum. In another, a ladder simply stopped being where it had been. When one of the underground depots 30 meters below the sea line chose to agree with the weapons thesis, the Earth's answer looked like a lie. Seawater licked at cracks as if the ocean were trying to read the city's plans. A long-range battery that had tangled with German columns too often went quiet, not because courage had departed, but because steel had decided to be honest. It was not Gustav alone. If the gun's champions later told the story as if a single barrel had moved history, the infantry and engineers who bled their way into the fortress belts told a truth more useful because it could be acted upon. Combined arms in a key lower than the music loved by men who give speeches. The Karl-Gerät mortars, 600-millimeter throats that spoke every hour they could speak, sucked chunks out of fortifications with the sullen, methodical power of a quarry. The Luftwaffe, relentless even when weather stole its adjectives, laid strings of bombs that taught roofs the concept of regret. Assault pioneers brought hollow charges and satchel loads, and a self-discipline that measured courage not in noise, but in exact distance from a blast. Gustav's rounds turned some problems into opportunities. Men with wire cutters and flamethrowers and pistols turned opportunities into facts. Maxim Gorky's armored domes did not explode theatrically at the moment a German archivist would later prefer. They were battered, pinned, and then finished. An engineering duel that ended not with a cheer, but with a door opening onto a room that had finally run out of air. Claims came hot, as they do in war. From the German ridgeline, the plume at the impact point could be seen before the sound arrived to argue with interpretation. "Bunker penetrated," an observer wrote after a shot that had felt truer than the others. "Battery silenced," another wrote with confidence that would be moderated later by ground truth. The ammunition dump beneath the sea line. Was it Gustav's round that unstitched it, or a confluence of pressure waves and previous damage, and an unlucky story about fuses? Museum studies and post-war analyses teach caution where soldiers remember clarity. What remains stable in both registers is scale. Gustav threw stones whose momentum could make poor engineering honest and good engineering older. Even when the blow did not kill, it aged structures by years in a second, shaking loose faith in walls among the men who slept behind them. Terror weapon is a phrase that abuses math unless you measure what terror buys. Minutes, openings, the collapse of a belief held too long. The cycle punished metal as much as men. 47, perhaps 48 rounds went downrange over the course of the operation, a number that feels small to those who count shells by the thousand, but weighs the calendar differently when each shot demands half an hour of choreography and recarves a barrel's interior with every lick of fire. By the end, the rifling's sharp sentences had softened. Engineers watched accuracy leave in small increments like a friend moving away in boxes. The barrel came off, and another took its place. A replacement with all the melancholy a replacement carries when the first has taught everyone how quickly new things become temporary. To change such a thing at a front is to argue again with cranes and gravity and margin, and to remind yourself that industrial miracles require not only factories, but patience capable of surviving bad coffee and good risk. Even in triumph, that careful conditional word, the weapon carried its own contradiction. The logistics that had made Gustav possible were as vulnerable in the long view as the fortress lines it assaulted in the short. To move such a machine required quiet skies and a kind of deference from the weather, both of which the Axis could no longer order at will past 1942. Allied air power would later teach any gun that traveled on rails what it meant to be a linear, predictable thing in an era that now worshipped diffusion and redundancy. Against a city anchored to old fortifications, the giant had found a theater that could cast it correctly. Against nations that built planes by the thousand and crews by the month, the giant would find itself an extra in a movie about mass. Sevastopol's collapse did not disprove Gustav's thesis. It proved that even a correct thesis can be irrelevant when the discipline changes. The German officers who had believed were not fools. They were engineers with ranks, men who had inherited a tradition that solved problems by building the largest precise machine that could possibly be built. They read the Crimean geology as a problem in calculus and chose a derivative the enemy could not match. Their math worked. But at the level where wars are decided, another equation hummed, one in which sortie rates and fuel stocks and pilot training pipelines weighed more than the most elegant single solution. The same notebooks that recorded charge weights and times also recorded delays caused by rails that sank a few centimeters in heat they had not signed up for, by bolts that wished to be tighter than human bones could make them, by cranes that wanted rest. Failure never arrived as a spectacular betrayal. It arrived as minutes turning into hours, and hours into other people's opportunities. Within Sevastopol, men on both sides learned to translate the gun's sound into expectation. Russian defenders could tell, after a few days, the difference between a Karl-Gerät syllable and a Gustav sentence. The Karl hit like a giant's thumb, the Gustav like a throne building. In certain galleries, guards would knock ash from cigarettes and say nothing for a full minute after a Gustav round, as if breath might disturb the geology. In others, a brittle gallows humor survived. "The Germans brought a railway to us," one sapper told another. "We should send the bill." When the underground depot went up, if up is the right direction for an event that began below the sea line, men who had retained their hearing for this long became elderly in an instant. Others took bruises that would make their ribs complain in old age every time a thunderstorm rolled in from the Black Sea. Watching the first concrete domes finally surrender after days of being hammered by a chorus, Gustav, Karl, Stukas spiraling like religious conviction, assault engineers clearing rooms with an intimacy no gun could know, German infantry learned a practical respect for the super heavy. Not worship, respect. A company commander whose men had eaten dirt 2 trenches back, and now stood in a wrecked casemate that smelled like scorched paint, and disbelief scratched a note in his diary. "Big gun opens locks. Pioneers turn handles." If you want an epitaph for the fantasy that any one wonder weapon could win a modern war, there it is, written in pencil by a man who had to be ready to change direction when a corridor broke left instead of right. Gustav was a key blank. The locksmiths were flesh. In the longer light of a season, the siege looks like a textbook that ordered students to read every chapter at once. Artillery duels that belonged to 20 years earlier mixed with air raids that belonged to a decade later. Infantry work that could have shamed any era dealt with corners the big machines had rounded, but not erased. Logistics sang its house tune over every scene. To feed Gustav a shell was to move a small car. To keep Karl speaking was to keep a delicate monster from sulking. To reload Luftwaffe racks with enough punctuality to matter was to run a warehouse ballet on tracks and roads that alternated between arrogance and despair. The Germans managed it because they could still concentrate excellence in a place and time. They could not repeat it everywhere, and everywhere was where the war would be decided. When the siege resolved itself, another conditional verb for a conclusion that felt more like exhaling than arriving, the defenders evacuated what they could and learned which parts of a city can swim. The port's guns, those that had not been blown into new definitions of scrap, fell silent as if ashamed of the noise they had made while the city bled. German propagandists filmed the big gun brooding like a cathedral on rails, and for a few weeks the weapon traveled the newsreels as proof that engineering could rewrite the stubborn grammar of fortification. Men at tables far from the Crimea put rulers against maps and imagined how many Gustavs would be needed to solve other problems. The rulers lied by omission. They measured length and forgot height. Height here being the Allied air umbrella that would, within a year, make any such congregation of steel less a threat than an invitation to be turned into a bonfire visible from orbit, if orbit had existed in 1943. Back at the spur, after the last round and the last cheer and the first sigh, crews began to undo a cathedral. The barrel, hot, tired, came down to be replaced. Wrenches chattered. Grease laid a black grammar on pale hands. Rails that had carried a monster returned to being lines across modest grass. A crane operator stared at the sky for a long time before he remembered that looking up had been a luxury deferred for weeks. His neck popped. He laughed without humor. The gun's logistics train packed itself in reverse order, a snake eating its own tail. Men who had lifted crates labeled with numbers that seemed too large to be real now lifted personal bags that seemed too small to contain what they had learned. The German officer who had said, "Registration at dawn," wrote a letter home explaining, truthfully, that the experiment had succeeded, and, quietly, that success had taught him the wrong lesson about victory. Elsewhere on the front, commanders who read the same reports placed their own bets on gigantism. Some paid off in a narrow sense. Most drew enemy attention and made the gods of chance smile. The Allies, watching with a mixture of respect and contempt, did their own math. Could they have built such a thing? Perhaps. Would they? No, not because they disliked feats of strength, but because their strategy practiced a different religion. Air replaced axle as the preferred altar. Numbers replaced spectacle. Many small hammers swung often, instead of one hammer so big the man swinging it must rest after each blow. By the time Gustav sneered from a new spur near Leningrad, and then Brody, and then vanished behind headlines more fatal than any shell, headlines that contained the words air superiority and bombing campaign and bridge interdiction. The weapons biography had become a cautionary tale told by men who still loved the lines of blueprints and the scent of cutting oil. Let us not flatter ourselves into thinking Sevastopol would have fallen without pain, if not for the gun. It fell because a concentrated German effort, organized down to the minute in service of a plan that did not leave room for improvisation so much as require it, pressed against a city whose lungs were already half airless. Gustav did not invent collapse. It hurried it where it could. Its most defensible contribution lies in the way it shattered places designed to survive everything else. The underground depot's destruction, 30 meters below sea level, as the records say, a number that turns eyebrows into lines, belongs in that ledger. So do specific silences. A battery that stopped trying to talk. A tunnel that chose to become two tunnels by way of a cave-in. A bridge of steel that learned the fragility of iron when 7 tons of argument met its midspan. Tally these, then place beside them the rows of wounded engineers and the black panes of dead windows in 10 neighborhoods that could not teach their children to sleep again for a month. How did it look from a trench? A soldier whose shovel had grown his fingerprints into its handle would tell you the big weapon wrote a new kind of weather into the sky. A smear that widened slowly, then forbade speech while the shockwave counted you. The ground answered like a drum. He learned to press his tongue to the roof of his mouth a second before the arrival to save his teeth. He learned to close eyes but not ears, because closing ears was impossible. He learned that courage takes different shapes depending on whether you are above ground or below. Above, courage needs movement. Below, courage needs stillness. Gustav taught stillness to men who had wanted, very much, to move. On the German ridge, observers peered through optics that turned kilometers into parties of ants. A shell fell long. A note went down in the ledger with the sour honesty of men who know they have done everything right and still lost a minute. The powder charge was adjusted. The barrel's wear factored. A wind that did not exist at ground level made a friend at 20 meters like a rumor does. Next shot. On. The target coughed. A photograph would later pretend the sequence had been inevitable. The men who had written the numbers knew better. One recorded in the margin a line that deserves to be remembered. We had to be lucky only in preparation. The hit took care of itself. If that sounds like arrogance, understand the reverse is true for defense. You can be perfect and still be punished by an enemy who has decided to spend 10 times your mass on an argument. By the end of the siege, 47 or 48 shots, depending on whose tally a museum chooses to honor, had left the breach and visited the city. The number moves by 1 because history is a human habit, not an equation solved once. Either count suffices to make the point. A barrel changed, a myth confirmed, a strategy exposed. German notes measured their triumph in penetrations and silences. Soviet notes measured their losses in rooms that no longer belonged to architecture, and in names written on boards outside aid stations. Both sets of notes share a single lyric. The blast. Men who stood near the gun spoke of it as if it vibrated tomorrow. Men who huddled far beneath the city received it as if it had to be remembered now and later both. Memory did not wait for peacetime. No one forgot. Many would later pretend to, because forgetting is how some men become parents and shopkeepers instead of ghosts. After Sevastopol, Gustav continued as a traveling thesis in search of honest disagreement. Sometimes the argument could not be staged because the other side had learned to speak in aircraft, and the sky refused to permit railways to play their old confident music. Sometimes the argument petered out because the front had moved in directions a straight piece of steel could not follow. Sometimes the argument roared on a new spur and still ended in ellipses because the next paragraph belonged to weather or to a general with a better idea about where to spend fuel. What never returned was the perfect theater, a fortress city that needed geology to stay alive, and a besieging army that could concentrate cranes, tracks, and patience in one corner of a war without paying 3 debts elsewhere. In later years, museum labels would struggle to decide whether Gustav was a marvel or a mistake. People who love machines, and we should count ourselves among them when we stand under a ceiling and bless stay bolts, lean toward marvel. People who count cost lean toward mistake. The truth is annoyingly adult. Gustav was a marvel employed by a strategy that did not deserve many marvels. It did what it said on the tin. The tin had been printed by men who confused solving problems with winning wars. You can admire the welds and still wish the welders had done something else that week. You can read the firing logs with respect and still know that respect belongs also to the crews who fed wounded through dusty corridors or patched rails under small arms fire because someone decided the big gun needed to move 3 meters to the left. And if you stand, as tourists do, beside a surviving shell in a museum that smells faintly of school varnish. You can put your palm against the metal and feel nothing but cool. That is a mercy. The heat it once held, the direction, the noise, those belong to a month in 1942 when the world briefly let a fantasy step onto a real stage and speak lines that made walls go quiet. A docent will tell you 7 tons, 7 meters, 39 to 47 kilometers. He will point to a photograph where men look like sympathetic insects around a machine that should not fit in a picture. He will call the thing by its name, and you will think, we build marvels because we can, not always because we should. And you will remember that Sevastopol fell, and a continent still did not belong to the men who had built the marvel, because other men, elsewhere, were building other marvels faster and training crews to use them with a patience the world had not seen. Somewhere in the archives lies the page that records the replacement of the barrel, the line item, and the signature. It is a banal document, a receipt with pride tucked into the corner. It tells you the story behind the story. Extraordinary is merely expensive when you can afford it. It becomes foolish when you cannot. In 1942, Germany could still afford certain kinds of extraordinary. In 1943, less so. In 1944, hardly at all. Gustav is a hinge in that door. It swings open in June and shuts somewhere over the Ruhr when factory roofs grow holes and bridges begin to forget their names. The weapon retains its beauty for those inclined to beauty in steel. The war moves on in a language that refuses to be charmed by a single, enormous noun. If the last word belongs to anyone, let it belong to an assault pioneer who walked into Maxim Gorky's shadow with a coil of wire and a pack that made his spine older by a decade. He had heard the big gun all morning. He had felt the stairwells breathe. He had watched dust turn sunshine into soup at the mouth of a casemate. When the moment came, he pressed his charges where training and the day's new cracks advised, pulled his men back with a voice that preferred tomorrow, and made the wall discuss compromise in the only tone walls understand. After, he lit a cigarette with a hand that shook in a way he would later control when he held his first child. Asked what the giant artillery had done for him, he said, "It made the door tired." Then he went to find the next door. That is as honest a biography as any machine deserves. It made doors tired. It terrified. It split concrete. It shortened arguments with architecture. It did not conquer. Conquest, that summer, still demanded men with wire and fire and maps folded to the right page. Later, when conquest changed its home address to places the big gun could not travel, airfields ringed with fighters, convoys crossing oceans under umbrellas of aircraft, factories turning minutes into engines, the biography shrank from a national destiny into a paragraph inside a siege. There is no shame in paragraphs. They compose chapters. But if your strategy depends on one paragraph being a book, then your printers will run out of ink before the library opens. The final trains rolled away from the spur at Sevastopol, their wheels saying a bilingual goodbye, German iron accents on Russian rails. The ground exhaled where the sleepers had been crushed. Children who had watched from a hill later brought friends to point at the place where the gun had stood, their fingers drawing rectangles in air. The city counted its dead. The sea returned to its usual mischief, pretending nothing had happened a few meters below where it learned otherwise. Somewhere in a file cabinet, under photographs of men standing proudly beside something that does not fit inside language, sits a memo that admits a truth without intending to. Even our victories are subject to the exchange rate of time. Gustav bought hours and days at Sevastopol at a terrible price paid by both sides. The Allies, months and countries away, were minting months and years. So remember the sound. Not the propaganda soundtrack, but the shockwave that made men polite to stones. Remember the crane lifting a barrel that had become a past tense. Remember a loading crew whose muscles ached in a way that would later make them curse thunderstorms. Remember a shell slung to the tray and a breach closing with the slow certainty of doors in old churches. Remember the men in the galleries who pressed their tongues to their palates and waited. Remember the assault pioneers who moved when movement mattered. Remember the engineers who left their fingerprints in grease on a page that listed charge for charge and could not list the weight of breath held in a dark. Then remember that the war was lost not because this machine failed in its promise, but because the promise belonged to an argument the other side chose not to have. Not bigger, but many. Not singular, but swarm. Not miracle, but method, multiplied. There is one more lesson the spur teaches under a noon that smells like creosote. Scale is not strategy. It is a tool inside strategy, and tools do not argue on your behalf when the debate moves to a different room. At Sevastopol, the room was concrete and stone, and the hammer fit the hand. Elsewhere, the room became sky and factory, schedule and sea lane. A nation that learns to prefer rooms it can furnish with many small tools will always outlast the man who insists on visiting each room with one magnificent object. Gustav was magnificent. The war did not care. There is one more lesson the spur teaches under a noon that smells like creosote. Scale is not strategy. It is a tool inside strategy, and tools do not argue on your behalf when the debate moves to a different room. At Sevastopol, the room was concrete and stone, and the hammer fit the hand. Elsewhere, the room became sky and factory, schedule and sea lane. A nation that learns to prefer rooms it can furnish with many small tools will always outlast the man who insists on visiting each room with one magnificent object. Gustav was magnificent. The war did not care. There is one more lesson the spur teaches under a noon that smells like creosote. Scale is not strategy. It is a tool inside strategy, and tools do not argue on your behalf when the debate moves to a different room. At Sevastopol, the room was concrete and stone, and the hammer fit the hand. Elsewhere, the room became sky and factory, schedule and sea lane. A nation that learns to prefer rooms it can furnish with many small tools will always outlast the man who insists on visiting each room with one magnificent object. Gustav was magnificent. The war did not care. There is one more lesson the spur teaches under a noon that smells like creosote. Scale is not strategy. It is a tool inside strategy, and tools do not argue on your behalf when the debate moves to a different room. At Sevastopol, the room was concrete and stone, and the hammer fit the hand. Elsewhere, the room became sky and factory, schedule and sea lane. A nation that learns to prefer rooms it can furnish with many small tools will always outlast the man who insists on visiting each room with one magnificent object. Gustav was magnificent. The war did not care. There is one more lesson the spur teaches under a noon that smells like creosote. Scale is not strategy. It is a tool inside strategy, and tools do not argue on your behalf when the debate moves to a different room. At Sevastopol, the room was concrete and stone, and the hammer fit the hand. Elsewhere, the room became sky and factory, schedule and sea lane. A nation that learns to prefer rooms it can furnish with many small tools will always outlast the man who insists on visiting each room with one magnificent object. Gustav was magnificent. The war did not care. There is one more lesson the spur teaches under a noon that smells like creosote. Scale is not strategy. It is a tool inside strategy, and tools do not argue on your behalf when the debate moves to a different room. At Sevastopol, the room was concrete and stone, and the hammer fit the hand. Elsewhere, the room became sky and factory, schedule and sea lane. A nation that learns to prefer rooms it can furnish with many small tools will always outlast the man who insists on visiting each room with one magnificent object. Gustav was magnificent. The war did not care. There is one more lesson the spur teaches under a noon that smells like creosote. Scale is not strategy. It is a tool inside strategy, and tools do not argue on your behalf when the debate moves to a different room. At Sevastopol, the room was concrete and stone, and the hammer fit the hand. Elsewhere, the room became sky and factory, schedule and sea lane. A nation that learns to prefer rooms it can furnish with many small tools will always outlast the man who insists on visiting each room with one magnificent object. Gustav was magnificent. The war did not care. There is one more lesson the spur teaches under a noon that smells like creosote. Scale is not strategy. It is a tool inside strategy, and tools do not argue on your behalf when the debate moves to a different room. At Sevastopol, the room was concrete and stone, and the hammer fit the hand. Elsewhere, the room became sky and factory, schedule and sea lane. A nation that learns to prefer rooms it can furnish with many small tools will always outlast the man who insists on visiting each room with one magnificent object. Gustav was magnificent. The war did not care. There is one more lesson the spur teaches under a noon that smells like creosote. Scale is not strategy. It is a tool inside strategy, and tools do not argue on your behalf when the debate moves to a different room. At Sevastopol, the room was concrete and stone, and the hammer fit the hand. Elsewhere, the room became sky and factory, schedule and sea lane. A nation that learns to prefer rooms it can furnish with many small tools will always outlast the man who insists on visiting each room with one magnificent object. Gustav was magnificent. The war did not care. There is one more lesson the spur teaches under a noon that smells like creosote. Scale is not strategy. It is a tool inside strategy, and tools do not argue on your behalf when the debate moves to a different room. At Sevastopol, the room was concrete and stone, and the hammer fit the hand. Elsewhere, the room became sky and factory, schedule and sea lane. A nation that learns to prefer rooms it can furnish with many small tools will always outlast the man who insists on visiting each room with one magnificent object. Gustav was magnificent. The war did not care. There is one more lesson the spur teaches under a noon that smells like creosote. Scale is not strategy. It is a tool inside strategy, and tools do not argue on your behalf when the debate moves to a different room. At Sevastopol, the room was concrete and stone, and the hammer fit the hand. Elsewhere, the room became sky and factory, schedule and sea lane. A nation that learns to prefer rooms it can furnish with many small tools will always outlast the man who insists on visiting each room with one magnificent object. Gustav was magnificent. The war did not care. There is one more lesson the spur teaches under a noon that smells like creosote. Scale is not strategy. It is a tool inside strategy, and tools do not argue on your behalf when the debate moves to a different room. At Sevastopol, the room was concrete and stone, and the hammer fit the hand. Elsewhere, the room became sky and factory, schedule and sea lane. A nation that learns to prefer rooms it can furnish with many small tools will always outlast the man who insists on visiting each room with one magnificent object. Gustav was magnificent. The war did not care. There is one more lesson the spur teaches under a noon that smells like creosote. Scale is not strategy. It is a tool inside strategy, and tools do not argue on your behalf when the debate moves to a different room. At Sevastopol, the room was concrete and stone, and the hammer fit the hand. Elsewhere, the room became sky and factory, schedule and sea lane. A nation that learns to prefer rooms it can furnish with many small tools will always outlast the man who insists on visiting each room with one magnificent object. Gustav was magnificent. The war did not care. There is one more lesson the spur teaches under a noon that smells like creosote. Scale is not strategy. It is a tool inside strategy, and tools do not argue on your behalf when the debate moves to a different room. At Sevastopol, the room was concrete and stone, and the hammer fit the hand. Elsewhere, the room became sky and factory, schedule and sea lane. A nation that learns to prefer rooms it can furnish with many small tools will always outlast the man who insists on visiting each room with one magnificent object. Gustav was magnificent. The war did not care. There is one more lesson the spur teaches under a noon that smells like creosote. Scale is not strategy. It is a tool inside strategy, and tools do not argue on your behalf when the debate moves to a different room. At Sevastopol, the room was concrete and stone, and the hammer fit the hand. Elsewhere, the room became sky and factory, schedule and sea lane. A nation that learns to prefer rooms it can furnish with many small tools will always outlast the man who insists on visiting each room with one magnificent object. Gustav was magnificent. The war did not care.